Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out on this extremely humid summer evening. Welcome to Darien Library. My name is Erin, and I do the programs for adults here. I would just like to briefly mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign. So thank you so much for your continued contributions to make programs like these and our collections available to the community. We have a very special author event for you this evening. This is actually the first time, at least since I've been doing these events, that we've had 3 authors. So that's very exciting. Yes, I think that merits a round of applause. So just to tell you a little bit about the format, because you may not be used to it with my events, is I'm going to first introduce our first author, and then she's going to come to the podium and talk for a little bit, and then so on and so forth with our next 2 authors. And then I'm going to ask them just a couple questions, and then we're going to open up to Q&A from the audience, so you'll have a chance to ask your questions as well. So thanks everyone for coming tonight. Our first author, Jami Attenberg, has written about sex, technology, design, graphic novels, books, television, and urban life for the New York Times, Salon, Print, New York, Nylon, Details.com, The All, Babel, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Huffington Post, Time Out New York, and some others. Her debut collection of stories, Instant Love, was published by Crown Shea Earhart Books in June 2006. She's also the author of 2 novels, The Kept Man and The Melting Season, both published by Riverhead Books. Her latest novel, The Middlesteins, was a New York Times bestseller, a USA Today bestseller, and an Amazon Top 10 Best Book of the Year for 2012. Meg Wolitzer, who's also here tonight, said of the book, "The Middlesteins is a tender, sad, and funny look at a family and their mother. In fact, it's so readable, it's practically edible." Please join me in welcoming Jami.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. I don't know if I've ever done a reading in Connecticut before, so here I am. It's a very nice library, too. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the book if you haven't read the book or if you're not familiar with it. It is about a Midwestern Jewish family from the suburbs of Chicago, and the matriarch of the family, Edie, is killing herself with food. And so 2/3 of the book is from different family members' perspectives. I was really interested in writing about a family in distress, a dysfunctional family. All families are dysfunctional, so I wasn't really stretching too much in that way. And I was interested in writing about food, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So 2/3 of the book are from the family members' perspectives and how you contend with somebody who just refuses to help themselves. And then about 1/3 of the book is written from, her name is Edie Middlestein, from either her perspective or her mother's perspective. And you see her at different weights in her life in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and aughts. I think that's right. It's been a while since I've written it, so I don't remember anymore. And so I'm going to read just a little bit from the very first chapter, which is in the 1950s in Chicago, and you see Edie as a child. And this is from her mother's perspective, and it's Edie, and she's at 62 pounds, and she's 5 years old. How could she not feed their daughter? Little Edie Herzen, age 5, not so little. Her mother had noticed this. How could she miss it? Her arms and legs, once peachy and soft, had blossomed into something that surpassed luscious. They were disarmingly solid. A child should be squeezable. She was a cement block of flesh. She breathed too heavy like someone's gassy old uncle after a meal. She hated taking the stairs. She begged to be carried up the 4 flights to their apartment. Her mother, aching, her back, the groceries, a bag of books from the library. "I'm tired," said Edie. "We're all tired," said her mother. "Come on, help me out here." She handed Edie the bag of books. "You pick these out, you carry them." Her mother, not so thin herself, nearly 6 feet tall with a powerhouse of body. She was a lioness who had a shimmer and a roar to her thick, majestic self. She believed she was a queen among women. Still, she was damp, and she had a headache, and the stairs weren't fun, she agreed. Her husband, Edie's father, always took the stairs 2 at once in a hurry to get to the next place. He was tall, with a thick head of dark, spongy hair, and had long, lanky, pale limbs, and his chest was so thin it was practically translucent, his ribs protruding, watery blue veins threaded throughout. After they made love, she would lazily watch the skin that covered his heart bob up and down, fast, slower, slow. At meals he ate and ate. He was carnal, primal about food. He staked out territory, leaning forward on the table, one arm resting around his plate, the other dishing the food into his mouth, not stopping to chew or breathe. But he never gained a pound. He'd starved on his long journey from Ukraine to Chicago 8 years before, and had never been able to fill himself up since. When you looked at all the things in the world there were to agree upon, they had so little in common, this husband and wife. He was not a patriot. America had always been her home. She was more frivolous than he with money, because to her, living in this vast, rich country in the healthy city of Chicago, it always felt as if more money could be made. They went to separate synagogues, he to the one favored by the Russian immigrants, she to the one founded by Germans 2 generations earlier, where her parents had gone before they had died, the synagogue in which she'd grown up, and she could not let that go, not even in this new union. He had more secrets, had seen more hardships. She had only watched it on the news, and he would always carry his daughter Edie wherever she wanted to go, on his shoulders, high up in the sky, as close to God as he could get her. And she was absolutely certain that Edie should be walking everywhere by now. But they agreed about how to have sex with each other any way they wanted, no judgment allowed. They're a very fun couple. And how often, nightly at least, and they agreed that food was made of love and was what made love, and they could never deny themselves a bite of anything they desired. And if Edie, their beloved, big-eyed, already sharp-witted daughter, was big for her age, it did not matter, because how could they not feed her? So most of the book takes place in 2010, though, but there are these little bits of the past in it. The question that I most get asked is, why did I decide to write about food, or have her vice be food? Because her vice could have been smoking, or drinking, or doing drugs, and those vices, if you quit them, you never have to do them again. But if you have a complicated relationship with food on either end of the spectrum, because there's a character in this book who's sort of on the other end of the spectrum, or has control issues with food in that way. If you have that relationship, you have to face it every single day, 3 times a day, 4 times a day, whatever it is. So in that way, it was a really layered, complicated issue for me, which is, a writer's dream. And then another reason why I wanted to write about food is because I really love food, and I tried really hard to make all the food sound delicious in this book. A lot of people read the book, and then when they get to the end of the book, they email me or say to me, I felt really weird because I was really hungry at the end of the book. And this is she's 350 pounds by the time she's done. And I was like, no, it's okay. It's okay that you felt that way, because I wrote to sort of make myself hungry too. But also there are some people who read the book and they just don't want to ever eat food again after they read it. And so the book is kind of really a real Rorschach test for what your relationship is with food. Whatever you bring to it, the book, and all the answers are, responses are correct. Everybody's response, whatever you like is correct. But I also, I was just interested in approaching it from a really compassionate place. And I think that people get judged really quickly based on what their, weight is in this country. And I was interested in thinking about it and writing about it. I think the final thing is that food to me is always associated with different life cycle events, like weddings and birthday parties and funerals, and that's something that kind of, you don't have to be a member of a Jewish family to understand that. It kind of crosses a lot of boundary, a lot of faiths and ethnicities and backgrounds, and so it was like a very natural guide for the life of this family in this book. And I just want to say that I'm really excited to be here with these two people. I've read both of their books. I love both of their books so much, so you guys should totally buy their books. That's it. Thanks.
Our next author is Meg Wolitzer, and Meg Wolitzer's novels include The Uncoupling, The 10-Year Nap, The Position, and The Wife. She's also the author of a novel for young readers, The Fingertips of Duncan Dorfman. Wolitzer's short fiction has appeared in the Best American Short Stories and the Pushcart Prize. In September 2013, along with singer-songwriter Susie Roach, she will be a guest artist in the Princeton Atelier program at Princeton University. Eden Lepucki wrote in The Millions of Wolitzer's most recent novel, The Interestings. The pure enjoyment of reading The Interestings belies its skill and craft. The narrative perspective, authorial yet also intimate, is so nimble. Wolitzer is able to pull off that rabbit out of a hat trick of offering wise and assured narration and then narrowing into a particular consciousness. Please join me in welcoming Meg Wolitzer.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. And Jami, I like that you said people only have to deal with food 3 or 4 times a day. That's giving me new permission and really new, exciting ideas for some new meal. What should we call it? Linner. Yeah. 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock. I know. It's true. I am particularly happy to be here tonight speaking in a library. Libraries have been really, really important to me for a very long time. Now, I grew up on Long Island in the town of Syosset, or to use its traditional Native American name, Exit 43. And every Friday night, my family would have dinner at the Cantonese restaurant, the only Chinese restaurant back then that existed, and then we would go to the library. And back in those days, my mother, Hilma Wolitzer, who is a novelist, had started publishing short stories. And she'd basically gotten a little fame as the one writer in our town. And nowhere was this more evident than at the library. Now, most kids don't particularly like it when their parent is a writer, and I say this from my own experience. When my son was 5 and we were walking down the street, we passed a McDonald's and there was a sign that said, "Now hiring." And he went, "Mom, look, do that." He really thought there was something just a little off about having a mother who was a novelist. But I actually liked that my mother was a writer, especially because when we went to the libraries on Friday nights, the person at the circulation desk would always let our family take out as many books as we wanted. So I'd grab this huge armload of books, everything from Go Ask Alice to My Darling, My Hamburger to Cherry Ames' Cruise Nurse. Doesn't that sound sort of dirty, actually? And then I'd kind of saunter up to the circulation desk, like really full of myself, and I'd drop this big pile of books down really showily. And I kind of, in some demented way, thought that my family was like the equivalent of the Kennedys in Hyannisport. So I've been asked to talk tonight, all of us, for 7 to 10 minutes, and I'm going to talk about my latest novel, The Interestings. And what I have to say will be so economical and will go by so swiftly that it will feel like one of those abridged novels that you used to read as children. Do you remember those? The ones that went, "All happy families are alike. But Anna's family was different. Look out, here comes a train," the end. To give you a sense of this book, The Interestings opens at a summer camp in 1974. And this, as you probably recall, is the summer that Nixon resigned. And back in that summer, I myself went to a summer camp in the Berkshires. And it was the kind of place where everybody wore leotards and played the cello and did batik. There's a word you don't really hear very much anymore. And where we also performed scenes from plays like Marat Sade. Now, if you haven't seen 15-year-old Cindy Ettinger playing Charlotte Corday, you have not seen that play. I made really, really great friends there, and many of them came from New York City. And they were smart and sophisticated in a very good way, and I wanted to be like them. And I walked around camp carrying novels with the titles facing out so everybody could see. And one of the ones that I had facing out was The Magic Mountain, which I never got past page 3. And there's a moment in my novel, The Interestings, early on, when a boy announces that his favorite writer is Günter Grass, and a girl says her favorite writer is Anais Nin, and somebody says that the only thing that Günter Grass and Anais Nin have in common is that both of them have an umlaut. And the boy says he's going to get one for himself, because obviously that's the way to go. But in real life, I was having a little fun with this idea of that kind of teenage pretension. In real life, my friends were really wonderful, and my best friend, who I dedicated The Interestings to, I met that summer at camp, and she remains my closest friend to this day. And because of those friends, I wanted to be an artist, I wanted to be expressive, and I wanted to basically have my own umlaut, metaphorically. And I went home at the end of the summer realizing that I was changing. And I think everybody I know has something like this in their own life. If you think about your own life, was there a moment when you found your people? And though I'd been acting in plays at camp, I was really pretty bad at it. And I thought that projecting was the same as emoting. And I would put on this terrible, terrible acting voice. And maybe you've heard the equivalent of it with poets. You know the poetry voice? Have you been to poetry readings, maybe in this room, where they go, I come into the room, the oranges are on the table. I don't know, where did they get that? Where do they all get together at a meeting and decide we're going to talk that way? Just a wondering on my part. So this was not the start of me becoming an actor, but I think in a weird way it was actually the start of my becoming a writer. And the wonderful writer Zadie Smith has a great line in an essay about novels called Fail Better, in which she says, when I write, I am trying to express my way of being in the world. And I think for the first time I was starting to see that I was trying to formulate my way of being in the world. Now, whether you become an artist or not, this kind of moment often happens in adolescence, but it can happen at different times in a person's life. And I grew up and I became a writer, but it took almost 40 years after that summer to realize that I really wanted to write a novel that started back then. And not just, it wasn't going to be like a teenage novel called That Firefly Summer, that ended at the end of August with them all hugging each other. It was going to keep going, and then keep going, and keep going until they're, in their 50s. So people often ask writers, and I'm sure that Rosie and Jami have been asked this question, how do you begin a novel? Do you begin with an idea, a character, a sentence? And I feel that there are so many ways in that it's almost like a novel is an advent calendar with all these doors and windows that you can open. And the past few novels that I've written, including The Interestings, have begun with an idea. And at first with The Interestings, I thought I was writing about envy and what happens to that quiet envy that you feel for people you love over time. The people, you could have great friends and you love them. Do you know anything like this? And they do something and it makes you just feel a little depressed about yourself, but you could never reveal that to them. But fairly soon, actually, I realized that what interested me the most here wasn't envy, but was talent. And I started thinking about the most talented people I'd known when I was growing up and what happened to them. And there was this fantastic series of documentaries that maybe quite a few of you have seen, the Michael Apted Up films, the 7 Up, 28 Up. This year is 56 Up. I always get scared when I say, I have to do the math, 54 Up. No, it's every 7 years he filmed these British kids who became adults. And you watch them go through life with all their disappointments and changes, and then they enter the soft pudding of middle age. And taken together, the whole enterprise sort of reminds me of what a novel can do. And my first writing teacher, the novelist Mary Gordon, said that you should write about what's important. And I've tried to use that. But what she means really, there's a parenthetical in there. What she means is write about what's important to you. So for me, what was important here was how people change, how their talents flourish, or how maybe they don't. And I thought about all those really talented people from my summer camp, and I wondered about what happened to them. Now, the internet, of course, lets you Google people from your past and find out about their lives and basically stalk them. I've heard tell you can do that. Not that I would personally, but truly nobody's life is a straight road. Even the most talented people, things happen, people die, there are breakups, things, you go live somewhere for another year. Nothing is linear. And one of the biggest factors, I think, involving talent is luck. And I was lucky to have had a mother, actually, who was very supportive of me being a writer. And I was lucky to have had a first grade teacher named Mrs. Gerby, who invited me up to her desk to dictate short stories for her. And she wrote them down much faster than I could. I was sort of like, take a letter, Mrs. Gerby. I was like, she was my executive secretary. When I think back to my earliest days as a novelist, I was 21 years old and I went down on the train from college to meet my first editor at Random House. And I got on the elevator of the old Random House building and carrying my little manuscript like from a copy center, sort of modest looking. And a priest got on and he was carrying a manuscript that was like this tall and bound up with the kind of rope you hang yourself with. And he looked at me and he said, do they know you're coming? And I said, yes. And he said, they don't know I'm coming. And I kind of think this is a metaphor for how readers feel about writers. They know we're coming, but sometimes they're very ambivalent about it. So I feel that what's incumbent upon all writers, whether they write fiction or nonfiction, is to make the sale, is to sort of give them a reason for why you're writing this book. And sometimes at a Q&A at an evening like this one, somebody will ask a kind of worried question about the future of reading. And to that I say this, that regardless of all the changes in technology and the ways that our brains have been sort of rejiggered by the internet, I think that what we all care about is story. And there's this desire for narrative that I think threads through all the generations. And to sort of prove this, sort of prove my point, I felt sort of vindicated by that, because I read a piece about how they showed footage of amoebas to a group of preschoolers. And they said, tell us what you see. And these little children said, that one's the funny one, that one's the mother. And they made a story up about one-celled organisms, and that gave me great, great hope. You start out giving special qualities to amoebas, and the next thing you know, you have these characters, and you're following them for almost 40 years. And on that note, I'm going to read you like the tiniest, tiniest bit from the very, very opening of the Interestings, which is this. On a warm night in early July of that long evaporated year, the Interestings gathered for the very first time. They were only 15, 16, and they began to call themselves the name with tentative irony. Julie Jacobson, an outsider and possibly even a freak, had been invited in for obscure reasons, and now she sat in a corner on the unswept floor and attempted to position herself so she would appear unobtrusive and yet not pathetic, which was a difficult balance. Julie Jacobson longed to unfold a leg or do that side-to-side motion with her jaw that sometimes set off a gratifying series of tiny percussive sounds inside her skull. But if she called attention to herself in any way, someone might start to wonder why she was here, and really she knew she had no reason to be here at all. It had been miraculous when Ash Wolf had nodded to her earlier in the night at the row of sinks and asked if she wanted to come join her and some of the others later. Some of the others, even that wording was thrilling. Julie had looked at her with a dumb, dripping face, which she then quickly dried with a thin towel from home. Jacobson, her mother, had written along the puckered edge in red laundry marker in a tentative hand that now seemed a little tragic. Sure, she'd said out of instinct. What if she'd said no, she liked to wonder afterward, in a kind of strangely pleasurable Baroque horror? What if she'd turned down the lightly flung invitation and went about her life thudding obliviously along like a drunk person, a blind person, a moron, someone who thinks that the small packet of happiness she carries is enough? Yet, having said sure, here she was now, planted in the corner of this unfamiliar, ironic world. Irony was new to her and tasted oddly good, like a previously unavailable summer fruit. Soon she and the rest of them would be ironic much of the time, unable to answer an innocent question without giving their words a snide little adjustment. Fairly soon the snideness would soften, the irony would be mixed in with seriousness, and the years would shorten and fly. Then it wouldn't be long before they all found themselves shocked and sad to be fully grown into their thicker, finalized adult selves with almost no chance for reinvention. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Our next author, Rosie Schaap, has been a bartender, a fortune teller, a librarian at a paranormal society, an English teacher, an editor, a preacher, a community organizer, and a manager of homeless shelters. Her father is legendary sports broadcaster and journalist Dick Schaap, and her brother Jeremy is a reporter for ESPN. A contributor to This American Life and NPR.org, she writes the drink column for the New York Times Magazine. She was born in New York City and still lives there. Fellow author Kate Christensen said of Schaap's memoir, Drinking with Men, "This book will be a classic. There is so much joy in this book. It's a great, comforting, wonderful, funny, inspiring, moving memoir about community and belief and the immense redemptive powers of alcohol drunk properly." Please join me in welcoming Rosie.
Erin, thank you so much for that great introduction. And it's so wonderful to be here. Hi, everybody. And such a treat to get to do this with two of my favorite writers, Jami and Meg, who are also fantastic people, but I bet you figured that out already. And I love both of those novels so much, so it's a real treat to hear you read. So Erin made it clear I've had a lot of jobs. There's always room for one more if you have any offers to make tonight. But it's really rare. Most Tuesdays at 7:30, I'm on the working side of a bar. This is really unusual. I took off from my bar shift tonight so I could be here, but part of me just wants to say, what are you having? That's what I'd be doing with a crowd most Tuesday nights. I'd be happy to pour you some Pinot Grigio, which is here. I can't do any Manhattans tonight, but please do come visit me behind the bar if you're ever in Brooklyn. So I know that Meg and Jami talked a lot about beginnings, why they wrote their books, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about why I wrote this book, Drinking with Men. It's a memoir, although I didn't think of it as a memoir when I started it. I thought of it as a collection of essays, and then lots of people in publishing said to me, stop calling them essays. I love essays, but apparently you can only get away with writing a collection of essays if you're already very famous for something, and I certainly wasn't. But it turned out that their instincts were also right. As I wrote this book, I realized that it is a story of a life, not my entire life. To my family's relief, I haven't spent my whole life in bars, but this is the story of my life in bars. And a few things really led me to write this. One is that I noticed something. I've been called by some people a serial monogamist when it comes to bars. I'll fall madly in love with a bar, and I'm curious, how many of you are bar regulars? Any bar regulars? Right on, okay, nice. Right, and do you feel pretty loyal to the bar you love? I've usually been loyal to the bars I love. And I think some of you are holding out on me there. I've usually been loyal, but things happen. A bar will close. In New York, because of just the realities of real estate in New York, a bar could be in a building that gets sold, and then it's gone really fast. And you have to move on. If you're still someone who needs to be a regular somewhere, you find yourself moving on. But even though I've had relationships with so many bars for so many years, there are 10 chapters in the book, each one focuses on a different bar and a different time in my life, I noticed something, and I don't know why it took me so long, but a few years ago, when I found a new place to be a regular, and I was really excited about it. It was like, meeting a boyfriend or a girlfriend and wanting to introduce them to your closest friends. So I wanted my closest women friends to come to the new bar that I'd fallen in love with. And they'd come and join me for a drink and have a great time and get it and see what I liked so much about it. But I realized they didn't have to come back the next night, or the next night, or the next night. And that's when I kind of understood that regularhood is largely a male condition. And without thinking really hard about it until I really started writing, I was sort of living a huge part of my life in this very, very male world. And in some ways had to become one of the guys, which is really fun in some ways and kind of a drag in other ways. So that's part of why I wrote this book. But Fairfield County, this book never would have happened without Fairfield County, which makes it really special to be here tonight. I was born and raised in Manhattan, but I spent 2 years of high school in Westport, not so far from here. And if that hadn't happened, if I hadn't been exiled to the suburbs in my youth, it never would have happened because, like any self-respecting New York born and raised kid, I took the train back into Manhattan once a week to see my shrink. So I was living in Westport, but taking the train back into the city once a week. And what was my first bar? The bar car on the Metro North New Haven line. This was my first bar. So I'm just going to read a little bit, also from the first chapter. They seem to all be starting at the beginning here. So you'll know just how important Connecticut is to this whole story. I may never have fallen in love with bars at all if it weren't for Connecticut. So the first chapter is called Bar Car Prophecy. In 1986, when I was 15, I discovered the bar car on the Metro North New Haven line, a dingy, crowded, badly ventilated chamber where commuters drank enough to get a decent buzz going, told dirty jokes, and chain smoked. These were my kind of people. Even though in my memory the whole place is clouded by a sort of grimy yellow film, it was my kind of joint. My mother had moved us, herself, my brother, me, a Shih Tzu, a Lhasa Apso, a cat, a parrot, from Greenwich Village to the suburbs a couple of years earlier for many reasons, but partly, I think, in a desperate bid to make a normal kid of me. It didn't work. I became a druggie, a deadhead, a reasonably resourceful truant, a small-time delinquent. But I was not without ambition. I wanted to be a mystic. Once a week, I got a reprieve from my suburban exile. After school every Thursday, I took the train from Westport to Manhattan's Grand Central Terminal to see my psychoanalyst. I'd been going since 8th grade, and I'd come to enjoy it. The 50-minute sessions made me feel like the featured guest on a talk show. It helped that my shrink sounded a lot like Dick Cavett. But from the moment I first stumbled into the bar car after one of our appointments, my return trip to Westport became the best part of my Thursdays. I liked the company of grown-ups, especially strangers. With them, I found it easy to feel smart and funny and interesting, easier than it was with my peers. I first discovered this one summer years earlier when I was 8 or so and my family was vacationing on Fire Island. Ma sent me to borrow a skillet from the neighbors, a bunch of 30-somethings in a shared rental. They were lounging on an L-shaped white couch and seemed to get a kick out of everything I said, even the word skillet. I wasn't sure what it meant until a tall, tanned woman handed me a heavy frying pan. I thanked her and turned to leave, but they weren't ready to let me go. They had questions. What grade was I in? Who was I? What was I into? I was astonished by their interest. I sat myself down on a puffy ottoman and asked if they wanted to hear a joke. Did they ever? So this Jewish American princess married an Indian chief. Guess what they named their baby? Whitefish. It's a terrible joke. I heard my mother tell it to one of her friends. I didn't exactly get it. But these grown-ups sitting there drinking wine tumbled off the big white couch laughing, and I felt like a superstar. That's not how I felt in the bar car. Surrounded by its regulars, mostly men in wrinkled suits and loosened neckties, I felt almost invisible, but I liked listening to them. They drank beer and scotch, laughed loudly, talked fast, and always seemed happy to see one another. They were a tribe, and I wanted in. Still, I didn't dare belly up to the bar and order myself a beer. There was no way the weary, wary Seen-It-All Metro North crew would serve me. I needed a point of entry. The night I pulled my tarot cards from my backpack and gave myself a reading right there in the bar car, I found just what I was looking for. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I've prepared one question for each of them, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And I'm just remembering that I turned off their mics. So after I ask my question, I'm going to run up and turn on their mics. My first question is for Jami. In the Middlesteins, Edie Middlestein begins to eat her way to obesity for reasons that are not quite clear from the beginning. But we do see how it affects the relationships that she has with her family. And at the library, I hear a lot from patrons. Sometimes they'll read a book and they'll say, you know, the book was okay, but I really didn't find the characters likable. So what do you think is up with this kind of obsession that we have to read about likable characters?
Okay, First of all, I just want to say that as a testament to my friendship with Rosie Schaap, I have heard her read from that chapter of the book like 8 times. And it always sounds good, so I'll never get sick of it. It's always something new and nuanced. You know, I just think people should read what they want to read, you know, like, read what they want to like. I personally I'm interested in characters that are flawed, that are deeply flawed. And I always start off, I mean, you could start reading this book, your book too, I mean, at the very beginning of the book, you sort of set the stakes, the emotional stakes kind of high. You sort of say, like, here's their flaws, here's what the problems are. And then I try to write my way into liking the people. I mean, or at least being interested in the people. I don't think there's anything wrong with people saying I didn't like the character, but were they fascinated with the character? Did they want to know what happened to the character? Did they want to make it all the way to the end of the book and find some sort of attachment or some sort of, you don't even have to have some sort of light and emotional hope. That's what I like to write. I like to put that in there, but I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to find a character likable, but there are people who want something, who choose to want something a little bit different. I mean, it's complaints sometimes where you see in reviews that the characters aren't likable, and I guess it all kind of depends on the reviewer. But I like to read things where people are kind of messed up.
I agree.
I like it when they're messed up, because I'm a little messed up. And it makes me feel better when they're messed up. Like, they're more messed up than I am. And then I'm like, at least I'm not that bad. So, but you can read what, I also don't believe in like the term guilty pleasure. Like, that does not exist in my repertoire anymore, because you shouldn't feel guilty for enjoying something. There's all kinds of books, there's all kind of art, music, movies, everything like that. So if it takes you to a different place, then that's like half the battle right there. Do you guys have any thoughts on this?
The only thing I would say is I actually just agreed to be in a piece in the New York Times called Guilty Pleasures. Seriously. And I wrote up by Valerie Harper.
Is it good? Yeah, it's awesome probably, right? It's probably good. The other thing, just to bring the memoirs into it, like, you're putting yourself out there.
That can be really unlikable.
Right. No, you're adorable, but like, yeah.
But it's interesting because a lot of my old bar buddies who are in the book, they teased me while I was writing, and they're like, "What did you say about it? Am I going to get in trouble?" And they're mostly teasing, but part of me was like, I think they're a little bit worried. I knew from the outset, writing this, that the only person who was going to repeatedly look bad in it was myself. And I feel like if you are writing a memoir, part of the deal is that you have to tell uncomfortable stories about yourself, and not always look good. It's kind of boring to just be the hero of your own story, and I feel like other people were a lot more heroic at many moments than I was.
I think that people connect with emotional honesty.
Yeah.
That's like words and all. Kind of,
Okay, my next question is for Meg. The Interestings is a sweeping tale of the bonds formed between teenagers at a sleepaway camp during the 1970s. And like you said in your talk, it doesn't just end when the summer ends, it continues for the rest of their lives. And so I don't just want to say your novel's about friendship, because it's about a lot more than that, like envy. But what attracted you to writing about the relationships between these characters as it developed through the decades, rather than a shorter time span?
One of the pleasures of writing a novel as opposed to short stories is that you can just keep going. And it's like there are different kinds of novels. I wrote a book called The Wife that's pretty short, and it's shapely. It's like it's got a shapely feel to it. It's a first-person book, and it kind of needed to end when it did because it's a first-person kind of angry, crazy, funny voice. But in this one, which is multiple third-person voices going into the different characters, if you like the characters, you could stay with them for a really long time. I mean, that's what I found. Like, I wanted to stay with them as long as I could sort of bear to be with them. And it just sort of kept going that way. So a novel gives you that sort of latitude. It's like a bag that keeps stretching a little bit. And, if you look at even some of the classic novels, they're sort of that way, like War and Peace, or even novels that have sort of sections that kind of, you're allowed, like in Anna Karenina, in fact, you can have an agrarian treatise, like go off on a side trip. If the reader is not bored, you can do that, because a novel can be about what the writer is thinking about at the time. And readers will accept that, whereas they won't accept that in a short story, which is sort of closer to a haiku in a strange way. But they will accept that in a novel. If they want to be in your voice and with those characters, they will follow them to the end of the world. And that's the nicest thing. You need to not be indulgent as a writer. You need to know when to get out. And in fact, that's why God made second drafts. And
editors.
And editors. I have a 3-hour lunch with my editor when I handed my book. And I'm feeling really good, and she sort of said she liked it, and we go out to Da Silvano in Lower Manhattan, we sit there, and then she's like, I think you can lose this whole, I'm like, what? The scene with the goats. Like, what? The scene with the goats? That's central to the whole thing. And then much later, like flash forward to 3 years later, I'm like, we're out having a drink. Can you imagine? I almost published the scene with the goats. What was I thinking? What was I thinking? Thank you for saving me. But you need to get it all down. And I teach quite a bit. And when I do, I tell my students, write 80 pages if you're writing a novel. Are some of you writers here writing a bit? Okay. I'm a big believer in the 80-page way of writing, which is that if you're starting a book, give yourself that number of pages. Don't go much longer, because if you write like over 100 pages and you give it up, you're going to feel bad. Like, I wasted my life. But if you write only 80 pages, you can feel proud of yourself, you can look at it, you can kind of carry it around and say, look what I did. But if you need to kind of give it up, you can. And then you go and, one of my favorite things to do is to go and sit somewhere and like in a coffee shop after I've printed out that number of pages and just sort of tear it apart. And you see what was indulgent and you see what was really useful. And then you kind of know the book you have, as opposed to the grandiose fantasy of the book you want to have. So I kind of feel, to answer your question really, it seemed that what I wanted to write about was time, and a novel allows you often to write about time.
I want to read the scene with the coats.
Yeah. There wasn't a scene with coats. I just made that up to show. All right, there's a scene with coats.
So my next question is for Rosie, and I feel I need to preface this so that my community members don't think that I spend lots of time alone in bars. I'm very professional. When I do spend time alone in bars, it's usually because I'm waiting for a friend to come, or I'm traveling and I want to, even if I'm traveling alone, like I still want to see what the bar scene is like. And my question for you is, what is the best way to strike up a conversation with the bartender that doesn't result in just small talk?
Ask your bartender, how are you? I'm surprised how seldom that happens. Most bartenders I know instantly love a customer who says, please, and thank you. You seem like a very polite crowd, but I'd say easily 50% of our customers don't use those words still, which is amazing. Much more important than a good tip. I don't care, what someone leaves me if they're engaging and patient and polite and contribute something to the culture of the bar. I mean, you can sort of tell when someone comes in, oh, Erin's really friendly, she's going to be fun at this bar, we're going to want to keep her around, we're probably going to want to give her a free drink or two. I mean, that's it. I think just being open, both with your bartender and the people on either side of you. You can sort of tell, you can pick it up. Oh, I can ask this person, how's your day?
Yeah.
And she's not going to be annoyed, and we're going to have a great conversation. That's all it is.
I would love to open it up to the audience for questions, and I think I'll call on people. That's probably easiest so that they don't have to do it. I know you have questions. Yes?
This is a question for Meg, and I have to confess I'm only 4 chapters in, so...
I'm going to have to ask you to leave.
Had me at hello. No. What I was taking notice of in reading the book, I'll try to talk loud, is you don't write it chronologically. You go back and forth at people at different ages. And what really struck me is the impact of that. I already know Jules and, I'm sorry, Ethan. Big guy, Dennis, thank you. I already know Jules and Dennis as an older couple, and then I have their first scene of intimacy. And it was such a different experience than the other order. So my question is, did you write it in that order? Did you move scenes around and go, oh, let me give them this first before they get that? You know what I mean? Did you play with that order?
No, you know what? I mean, it's so funny. I'm married to a writer, and he'll say, oh, I'm working on the end of the book. And I'm like, what? What do you mean? I have never written anything out of order in my life. And I kind of feel like I have these, this is completely crazy, but all the women writers I know write in order, and the men write out of order, and all the women I know like baths, no men like baths, and all the women I know hate milk, and the men like milk. So I have these generalizations about men and women. But I will say that I wrote it in order, in this out of order order.
Oh, okay.
But the reason I did is because I realized when I was thinking about how we think of the past tense versus the present tense, there is really no past tense. I mean, while you're sitting here, you're probably thinking about something that happened this morning, or where you're going to go later, or what you have to do tomorrow. I feel that we have a toggle about the past and present. And for me to write this book in a straight chronological order just sounded like is a book about adolescence and everything that happens after. I'm going to open in the most intense moment, the scene where they all meet at camp. And do we really need to take 200 pages to get us into adulthood? I don't think so. Let's see where they become as adults. But let's keep referring back to that powerful moment. And I allowed myself that and hoped, hoped for the best.
It worked.
Yes, in the middle.
I'd just like to make comments about inhabiting a bar. I believe it was George Carlin. He died. His obituary, they mentioned his favorite bar on 108th in Broadway.
Oh, yeah?
It was really like part of his obituary. George Carlin. Yeah. So that was.
Yeah,
That
that
what
is,
you're talking about.
that is really interesting. For some of us, a bar really becomes a place that's kind of equal to home and work, a place that's so much a part of our life. I just don't know which bar they would use on my obituary. I don't know. Jamie, can I leave that up to you?
Yes. No, don't die.
Okay, anyway. That's interesting, thank you.
Yes, in the blue.
And one of the things I notice about the three of you is that you all have an enormous sense of humor, and you don't seem to take yourselves completely seriously. And I don't mean that you don't take yourselves seriously as writers, but how important is it to you to have this sense of humor about your writing even?
Listen, it's a rough ride, so you kind of gotta have a sense of humor about it. I mean, it's a hard job, like just a hard way to make a living for starters. So if you get too intense about it, it's gonna kind of ruin. You'll get a little bit crushed by it. I think maybe we're raised that way, kind of to be funny people, where we have funny family members and things like that. I don't know. I do take my writing seriously. It's my favorite thing to do in the world. It's really important to me, and I have a very serious intention with my work. But I am definitely one of those laughs through the tears kind of person. Yeah.
Yes, in the yellow.
Meg, I have to tell you, I'm a groupie since way, way back. Stranger Jar Thieves, I think the first one, I've read every one of your books. I love you. So I just wanted to know which is your favorite.
This one and The Wife.
And The Wife is going to be our book club for next
Nice.
month. I liked it.
It's shorter than this one too. It's funny, I realized when I wrote The Wife, it was like I entered a sort of new phase of my career, and I guess I got more visibility. And looking at that sort of suite of books that's followed, I realized that each and every one of them began with the title, and none of the ones before that had. And like in a funny way, it's not a coincidence. It was sort of like I figured out what I was writing about. I was writing from an idea, in a sense. What happens, like that novel, The Wife, is really about male power and female collaboration with male power, as among other things. And it was kind of like I was just sort of stepping up to the idea of, what is the book about? When you go into a bookstore or a library and you stand before the new fiction shelf, do you feel overwhelmed like I do? I mean, the covers look beautiful, but you start to read a book and I feel like what makes you put it down is that thing about, why is the writer telling you this? Like you ask, why are you telling me this? And you can't really answer why. And I feel that's what I was sort of getting at before, that the writers now, especially now that everybody's attention is being drawn in a million directions, need to sort of create almost a kind of urgency. And I feel like these books do. These are such powerful, incredible books, both of your books, I absolutely mean it. That every novel and every nonfiction book is a story that you couldn't get anywhere else. And I feel like the books that I wrote from that period on are ones that I am prouder of, because I felt more mortal as I got older. I mean, I started young, but I matured late. So
How long ago did The Wife come out?
it came out in, I'm going to say 2003.
Have you gone through, sorry to hijack the question, have you gone through this thing with it, so it's been 10 years since it came out, where like, I don't ever want to talk about this book again, and now I love this book again, or, you get sick of it and then...
The only thing you get is when everybody tells you, when you have several books after that, and people say, yeah, that was good, but I have to tell you, I like that one more. It's sort of like people coming up to Woody Allen and saying, I love Annie Hall. I mean, it's like when they go to an old thing, but I don't know, you should never reject something people really love that you've done, because you should in fact think of it as like, what was I guess I was real in that book. I guess it was more myself. I feel like what novels do, what writers do, nonfiction writers do as well, is when they're really working in a good place, it's like that work is like a bouillon cubed version of who they are, their sensibility. What I said about Zadie Smith saying, she writes to express her way of being in the world. A book that you love is probably close to how the writer is sort of in the world, the way his or her friends know them. I say to students sometimes, if they're trying to find a voice, like, what are you thought of? How are you thought of among your friends? What are you? You're the blank one. And maybe those qualities, do you get rid of them when you're writing in a kind of way that is formal? Maybe more of that should be in there. And I think I started to do that with that book. But I'm very fond of The Interesting Side. That's the book for me that was the most emotional.
I loved it also. I loved them all. I really
Yeah.
loved the books. And I can't even buy one to sign because the last bunch of them are on the Kindle, So
I know, the Kindle is
it's a problem.
Yeah, it's an issue. But thank you so much.
Yes, in the front.
I loved your book. I really did. I haven't read the other two, but I promise I will.
Please do.
But I have a confession to make. I bought your book because your cover is very, or it grabs your attention when you're in the bookstore. You're just jumping out at everybody. And I like to think of myself as an emerging artist. Does it have any bearing on the story, or is it just a great cover and you loved it?
Well, it has bearing on one thing that I will say, and I don't want to hog this, but just very quickly I'll say, I wrote a piece in the New York Times book review a year ago, April, and it was about my perceptions of the different ways that men and women were treated who wrote novels, and that there was a sort of second shelf, they called the piece the second shelf. And when this book came out, when this book was being produced, my editor at Riverhead walked that piece into the art department and said, read this piece and now design the cover. And what I had noticed, and I've joked about this with Jami before, and you'll hear why, is that books by women sometimes had pictures on the cover of Little Girl in a Field of Wheat. And Jami?
My last book cover was a woman running through a field of wheat. Nothing to do with this book at all.
We did an event together in Brooklyn, and I'm saying my thing, and on the wall, there's Jami's cover of the girl in a field of wheat, and I'm like, I can't get out of this now. It's sort of like saying, but some girls in fields of wheat are good. Right. It's sort of like in college, I remember going to a supermarket with a friend and making fun of Spam, and she said, my mom likes to cook Spam in a pinch, and I said, yeah, but hot or cold? She said, oh, hot. I said, sure, hot's great. But I think this cover does, just in a design way, I think covers should invite you in like a box of chocolates. Books need to be, as I said about Jami's fantastic book, edible. It's a wonderful, beautiful cover.
No wheat.
No wheat. It's wheat-free. It's amazing. It's a celiac novel. Celiac people. But it's like, it invites the notion really of arty, batik things, and I also particularly like how it ends there. So they did it. Designing books is so hard, they did a great job. So
It's great. But they all are beautiful books. They're all great.
In the back corner. Oh, yep, you.
So I have a question for Rosie and Jami, because I think I want to ask a little bit about sort of their views on the changing role of women. And for Jami specifically, food was what women produced, what they offered. But you see Edie as this huge consumer. And so what that reflects sort of about the changing role of women, if it does. And then Rosie, thinking specifically about how not that long ago one could not go into a bar. She was either a Target, or today she's either Target or Uber. Just to talk a little bit about what you see and what that reflects.
Well, Edie is not that interested in being a homemaker. She kind of lives a life of the mind, but she fell into that just generationally being, coming up in the 1950s, getting married in the 1970s, but she sort of just missed being a hippie. And she kind of came from this place of, you stayed married, you had the kids, you stayed married no matter what. And then she was sort of trapped in it. And she becomes kind of really resentful of it. And I think that's part of like consuming the food really is how she's filling that
that gap in her life. Not to oversimplify it, but that's really a big part of the thing. And there's even, and so she's like kind of, I really am fascinated actually with characters that are inherently feminist, that don't actually say that they're feminists. Like, because I have a really complicated, not really complicated, I have a relationship with feminism where my feminism is very particular to me. I think it's hard to define it, but I know that I always have been it. I feel like I was born it, you know? So I'm interested in, I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, but I am really interested in writing characters that are, by their action, are feminists, whether or not they feel the need to proclaim it. Is that? I mean, that's what I have to say about it, I guess. Yeah. But she doesn't, she consumes. She's not really interested in, she's not a huge, she's a nurturer, but she's not maternal, if that makes any sense. Like, she's interested in, like, helping people and educating people, but when it comes to her children, she's sort of constantly reminded that they exist by them. That makes, they just sort of, oh, I should feed you now, kind of thing. So, which is how I would be as a mom, probably. That's why I'm not a mom.
Thinking about your question, I was thinking about my mother also. And when I really got to be a real bar regular, as soon as I turned 21, my mother, if you read the book, you'll discover my mother was no Puritan, and she certainly liked her whiskey sours just fine. But when it became clear, and I was so unself-conscious, like I loved the bar that became my first real local when I was in college so much. And it was this really sweet, cheerful, little local Vermont small town place. and I would talk to my mom about it. We'd talk, once a week, and like, oh, it's such and such class, and then I'm going to go meet so-and-so at the bar, and she kept hearing me mention, it didn't occur to me to think I shouldn't be telling my mother I'm going to a bar almost every night. It seemed like such a good and wholesome development in my life. But my mother, she got worried, and one of the first things she said was, have you ever read or seen Looking for Mr. Goodbar? And I said, no, I haven't. And I'm guessing a lot of you have seen or read it. It's based on a horrible true story. I think it's a terrible movie, but an affecting one anyway. And a picture of bar culture and the way I was experiencing bar culture, just completely alien. The bar, and this bar, it has a different name, but it's still there on the Upper West Side. So completely different from the little bar where I was hanging out, where I felt actually really looked after, where it wasn't like a hookup place at all. It's just this little small town place where when I was sick, the sisters who ran it would bring soup to my house. It's the first place I ever tended bar. So there was just such complete disagreement between my mother's idea of what was going on in my life and what I knew was going on. I think she calmed down. She came up and visited and met the sisters and saw how sweet and homey. But I think it is very, very easy for women to internalize these ideas about bar culture. I think of Looking for Mr. Goodbar. I think of The Accused. I think of, these really awful, scary, and frankly, cautionary and moralizing images of bar culture that are so different from the bars I know, but I think it's hard to get away from them. So even now, I think a lot more women are willing to go to bars on their own. And one thing about being a regular is once you become one, you're never alone in a bar. Oh, there's so-and-so. There's Sheila. I haven't seen her in a week. I have to ask her about her new job. Once you start to know people and you're a regular, you're not alone in a bar anymore. But I get mail. I meet young women. Oh, I can't go into a bar alone. Either someone's going to try to pick me up, and I don't want that. I just want to go and read a book and have a drink and have a quiet night at a bar. Or people are going to think it's just really sad for a woman to be alone in a bar, that there's something abject about it. And I'm trying to fight those ideas about bar culture, because what I found has been so much happier than that.
We have time for 2 more questions. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much. Your warmth and your generosity of spirits for each other is just absolutely beautiful.
Oh.
And it's a pleasure and privilege to hear you speak. Question for Rosie and a question for Jami. We'll start with the easy one for Rosie.
Oh, yeah?
Where in Brooklyn is your bar?
Mine's
Or the bar?
The bar. The bar where I work, and I only work Tuesdays from 2 to 9. It's called South.
And if you take the R train to Prospect Avenue, it's a block from there. And it's really sweet. I mean, to me, it's, you know, I write a lot about cocktail culture. It is not a cocktail bar. It's a mom and pop neighborhood bar. Well, that's contested a little bit. It's the southern end of Park Slope, near historic Greenwood Cemetery. So I recommend you make a day of it. You can go visit Basquiat's grave and Lola Montez's grave, and then come over and have a beer and a Manhattan. Our Manhattans are really good.
And for Jami, is your book, is any part of it drawn from your personal experience, or was it just fiction?
Well, you know, it's set in the community where I grew up. So I read Olive Kitteridge. I don't know if you've read that.
Yes.
Okay, this is the Olive Kitteridge territory, which is an amazing book. And when I read it, so this was probably 6 months before I started writing Middle Scenes, I thought I could write something like that for my. And it was I hadn't lived in my hometown for 20 years. And I read it, and it was so intimate about this town. There was just something about it that made me feel like I could do the same thing, although totally differently, obviously. And so that was kind of the starting point for me. You know, every reading that I do in Chicago, my still married parents who go to the gym regularly and eat well come to every reading, wave their hands so everybody knows that it's not them. But they would like you all to know that it's not them. But there's sort of, you know, it's definitely about the community where I grew up. It felt very familiar to me. I did a reading in my hometown library a couple weeks after the book came out, and it was 100 middle students in the room with me. And that was the audience that I really needed to face. Even though there isn't anyone in there, but there's always just little nuggets. There's always tiny little things that, you know, you keep with you for 20 years or 30 years, or it could happen the day before, and it just turns into something more. I can tell you that, I don't know if you actually read my book or not, but there is a chapter in the book that's written from a group perspective at a B'nai Mitzvah, and so when I did the reading in my hometown, all my parents' friends came to it, and so they probably knew half the people in the room. And then at the very end, after everyone left, all my parents' friends they've known for a million years, were standing around, and they all gossiping about everyone. I was like, that's it. So if there's anyone in the book that really is coming, you know, and that's not even a character, that's a group voice. But if there was anyone in the book that was sort of inspired by someone, or any chapter that was inspired, it was probably that collective voice, which it really felt like the collective voice of the community, kind of the way we gab, the way we assess. I mean, my favorite part of a party is always after the party, staying behind with one person and talking about everything that just happened. So that's, yeah, and I really do love food, and I don't know, I love all these people. They were all a little part of me, definitely. It was hard to say goodbye to them.
Yes, last question.
Ms. Wolitzer, talking about voice, was it total recall of how you talked at that age? Because I was at camp too. And I'm sure, I was so immature, I'm sure I never had such wonderful conversations like that, although my best friend, we're still best friends. You know, the friendships were tight. And then the only time I heard real teenage conversation was in the back of the car driving my kids when they were 3 teenagers to either school or whatever. And they were trying very hard for me not to hear it. I don't have an accurate sense of teen talk. I now talk to my grandchildren, and they really talk like very, very sophisticated people, but they say like a lot. Go up at the end of the sentence. And that just, it sort of spoils the conversation almost for me, even though they're very dear to me.
But I talk that way too, so.
I'm wondering, how did you recall all of that?
Well, I didn't really talk like these characters in this book, I have to say. I kind of, oh God, the things that I said were so dumb back then. I mean, but I did remember, you know, when you're writing dialogue, it's almost representative. It's not like, because you're not just A novel isn't like a roulette wheel is being spun and you're stopping here and you're listening to people say, do you want more cheese? Talking about it for 10 minutes. There was this incredible Lily Tomlin sketch in which she's listening to her parents talk about cake. And she keeps opening the door and it's like, you know, she hears, well, do you like the cake? And she slams the door. She's like, you know, she can't stand her parents talking about the cake. And she opens it up again. Lud, do you think the cake is kind of good? You know, and finally she goes out in the hall and shouts, shut up about the cake! You know, and I feel like that's what a random conversation would be in a novel, which is why what I do when I write conversation is do a kind of heightened version of the way people talk. So it's not exactly the way we talk. I mean, there are different kinds of fiction. There's room for so many kinds of things. Because I was setting it in the past and they were trying to be intellectual and pretentious, I gave them a lot more, you know, sort of intelligence than I think I had. But I also kind of gave them, my son was a little scandalized because of some of the language that I sort of used in the book, and he thought I could do it a little less of it. This is the same one who said I should work at McDonald's. You know, what dialogue can do is not necessarily create verisimilitude, but put you there and you almost feel like, oh, there are people talking that way. But I think that really I was at a very between stage. When I went off to that camp, I had 1 foot left over in David Cassidy territory and 1 foot, you know, reading Sylvia Plath. And wow, my feet are reading Sylvia Plath, that's amazing. But I was sort of like, I'm sure I sounded incredibly dumb, and I have moments where Jules, my character, does too, and sort of says, if anybody asked her if she liked Gunter Grass, she'd say, well, I haven't read as much of him as I would have liked. You know, and she read 0. I wanted to show that kind of ultra self-consciousness. That's the main thing I wanted to get across about adolescence, but don't worry, I'm sure you were no dumber than I.
That's such a great note to end on.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I encourage you to buy a book, have a glass of wine, get your book signed, chat with the authors, and have a great evening.